Welcome back to Moonlit Histories, where we journey through the corridors of time to uncover the stories that shaped the world of Islam. Tonight, we venture into the life of a man whose very name became synonymous with victory, a warrior whose sword was never broken in defeat, a commander whose tactical brilliance echoes through the centuries. This is the story of Khalid ibn al-Walid, the man the Prophet Muhammad himself named Saif Allah, the sword of Allah. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the Arabian desert in the early 7th century. Picture vast expanses of sand stretching endlessly beneath a merciless sun, punctuated by oases of green where palm trees sway and precious water flows. In this harsh and unforgiving landscape, where survival itself demands strength and cunning, where tribal warfare is as natural as breathing, a child was born who would grow to become perhaps the greatest military commander in Islamic history. His story is one of transformation, of a fierce enemy who became an even fiercer champion, of battles won against impossible odds, and of a humility that matched his prowess. The world into which Khalid was born was one of profound change, though few could have known it at the time. The great empires of Byzantium and Persia, ancient rivals who had exhausted themselves in decades of warfare, stood as towering giants on either side of the Arabian Peninsula. Between them, the Arabs lived as they had for centuries, divided into countless tribes, bound by codes of honor and blood feuds that stretched back through generations. Mecca, the city of Khalid's birth, was more than just another Arabian settlement. It was the beating heart of Arabian commerce and spirituality, home to the Kaaba, the ancient cubic structure that even then drew pilgrims from across the peninsula. Into this world of shifting sands and ancient traditions, Khalid ibn al-Walid ibn al-Mughira was born around the year 592 CE. His timing was impeccable in ways that would only become clear decades later. He entered life just as another child, born some 22 years earlier in this same city, was beginning to receive divine revelations that would shake the foundations of the known world. That child was Muhammad, and he would become the prophet of Islam. Khalid would become his sword. The lion cub of Makhzum. The clan into which Khalid was born carried weight and prestige that few could match. The Banu Makhzum were one of the most powerful clans of the Quraysh tribe, the aristocrats of Mecca, and they held a position of particular importance. They were the military leaders of the Quraysh, the masters of warfare, the trainers of warriors. When Mecca needed defenders, when caravans required protection, when battles needed to be fought, it was to the Banu Makhzum that the city turned. This martial tradition ran through Khalid's blood like an inheritance more precious than gold. His father, al-Walid ibn al-Mughira, was a man of tremendous influence and wealth. He was not merely rich. He was one of the wealthiest men in all of Mecca. His fortune built on trade, on the caravans that moved precious goods between Yemen and Syria, between the incense of the south and the silks of the north. More than his wealth, al-Walid possessed political power. He was an arbitrator, a man to whom others brought their disputes, trusting his judgment and wisdom. His word carried weight in the councils of Mecca. When decisions needed to be made about the affairs of the city, al-Walid's voice was one that could not be ignored. But al-Walid ibn al-Mughira would also become known for something else entirely. Islamic tradition identifies him as one of the fiercest opponents of the new message that Muhammad began preaching. He was, according to historical accounts, the derider mentioned in the Meccan chapters of the Quran, a man who mocked and opposed the Prophet with particular vehemence. This opposition was not merely personal, it was political, economic, and social. The message that Muhammad brought threatened the very foundations of Meccan society, challenged the tribal hierarchies, questioned the worship of the traditional deities housed in the Kaaba, and promised a new order that would overturn the old ways. For a man like al-Walid, who had prospered under the existing system, who held power in the traditional structure, this new teaching represented an existential threat. Into this household, then, Khalid was born. Following the customs of the Quraysh nobility, he was not raised in the city itself. Instead, as was the tradition among the aristocratic families of Mecca, the infant Khalid was sent to live with a Bedouin tribe in the desert. This practice, seemingly harsh to modern sensibilities, was considered essential for the proper upbringing of a noble child. The desert air was thought to be pure and wholesome, far healthier than the crowded conditions of the city. Living among the Bedouin, a child would grow strong and hardy, would learn the pure Arabic language uncorrupted by foreign influences, would develop the self-reliance and toughness that the harsh desert environment demanded. For perhaps 5 or 6 years, young Khalid lived this life, breathing the clean desert air, learning to endure hardship, absorbing the ways of the nomadic tribes. When he returned to Mecca, he was no longer merely a city child. He carried with him the resilience of the desert, the endurance of the Bedouin, qualities that would serve him well in the years to come. He bore one permanent mark from his childhood years, a memento that would stay with him for life. Like many children of his era, Khalid had contracted smallpox during his youth. He survived the disease, but it left its signature on his face, light pockmarks on his left cheek, scars that would become as familiar to his warriors as his battle cry. Back in Mecca, Khalid's true education began. As a son of the Banu Makhzum, as a member of the clan that held military leadership among the Quraysh, his training focused intensely on the arts of war. This was not the casual instruction that other boys might receive. Khalid was being groomed to be a warrior, a leader, a commander. He learned to ride before he could barely walk, spending hours in the saddle until horse and rider moved as one. The Arabian horses, bred for endurance and speed, magnificent creatures adapted to the harsh climate, became extensions of his own body. He could ride at full gallop across treacherous terrain, could turn in an instant, could fight from horseback with the skill that would later terrorize his enemies. Weapons became his companions. The sword, that elegant instrument of death, was balanced in his hand until its weight felt natural, until he could draw and strike in a single fluid motion. The spear and the lance, weapons of the cavalry charge, were mastered until he could couch them properly, could strike with devastating force from the back of a galloping mount. The bow, weapon of the skilled warrior, required years of practice to truly master. The Arabian bow was a weapon of precision and power, and Khalid learned to use it with deadly accuracy, both on foot and from horseback. His shoulders and back developed the powerful muscles needed to draw the bow repeatedly in battle, to maintain accuracy even when exhausted. But Khalid's education was not limited to mere physical skill. War, true war, requires more than just the ability to fight. It requires understanding, strategy, the capacity to read terrain and weather and human nature. The Banu Makhzum had centuries of military experience, and they passed this knowledge down through their sons. Khalid learned to read the desert as a scholar reads a book. He understood how to find water in seemingly barren land, how to navigate by the stars, how to judge distances across the deceptive expanses of sand and rock. He learned the tactics of desert warfare, how to use mobility and speed to compensate for smaller numbers, how to strike suddenly and withdraw before the enemy could mount an effective response, how to endure in conditions that would break lesser men. He also learned leadership, that intangible quality that separates commanders from mere fighters. In Arabian society, a leader had to be more than just skilled in combat. He had to inspire loyalty, had to be generous with the spoils of war, had to be brave enough that men would follow him into the jaws of death. Khalid absorbed these lessons, watched the leaders of his clan, understood the bonds that held warriors together, and the cracks that could shatter an army. He learned that fear and respect are not the same thing, that true authority comes not from mere position, but from proven ability and personal courage. By the time Khalid reached manhood, he had become everything the Banu Makhzum could have hoped for. He was tall and powerfully built, his body honed by years of training and practice. His movements carried the grace of a natural athlete, the economy of motion that comes from perfect control. His face, marked by those childhood scars, was strong and commanding, his eyes sharp and intelligent. When he walked through the streets of Mecca, people noticed. Here was a warrior, a leader in the making, a man who carried himself with the confidence of someone who knows exactly what he is capable of achieving. His reputation grew among his contemporaries. The young men of the Quraysh, particularly those of the Banu Makhzum, looked to Khalid as a model of what a warrior should be. He excelled in the martial competitions that were common among the Arabian tribes, demonstrations of horsemanship and weapon skill that served as both entertainment and training. Stories began to circulate about his prowess, tales that would only grow more impressive with time. In a society that valued martial ability above almost all else, Khalid was becoming a man of note, someone whose name was spoken with respect. But all of this was unfolding against a backdrop of growing turmoil in Mecca. Muhammad, who had begun receiving revelations around the year 610 CE, when Khalid was still a youth, was preaching a message that was tearing the city apart. The new faith, Islam, submission to the one God, was attracting followers, particularly among the lower classes and the slaves. The traditional power structure of Mecca was being challenged, and men like al-Walid ibn al-Mughira, Khalid's father, were at the forefront of the opposition. The reasons for this opposition were complex and multi-layered. On one level, there was genuine religious conviction. The Meccans worshipped a pantheon of gods housed in and around the Kaaba, and the annual pilgrimage to Mecca brought enormous wealth to the city. Muhammad's strict monotheism threatened this lucrative arrangement. On another level, there was social and political concern. The message of Islam emphasized equality before God, regardless of tribal affiliation or social status. This was revolutionary, potentially destructive to the carefully maintained hierarchy of Arabian society. On yet another level, there was simple human resistance to change, the natural conservatism of people who have prospered under an existing system, and fear what a new order might bring. Khalid, raised in this environment, trained by men who opposed Islam, surrounded by family members who saw Muhammad as a threat, naturally became an opponent of the new faith. This was not merely passive opposition. Khalid was a warrior, and as the conflict between the Quraysh and the Muslims escalated from verbal opposition to physical persecution to outright warfare, Khalid would find himself on the front lines, fighting against the very people he would later lead to unprecedented victories. The Battle of Uhud, Genius against the Believers. The year was 625 CE, and the city of Mecca was preparing for war. 3 years earlier, at a place called Badr, the Muslims of Medina had dealt the Quraysh a devastating blow. Despite being outnumbered roughly 3-1, the Muslims had won a decisive victory, killing many prominent Quraysh leaders, including Abu Jahl, who had been Khalid's cousin and one of the most fierce opponents of Islam. The defeat at Badr had been a humiliation for the Quraysh, a stain on their honor that demanded revenge. More than that, it had been a financial disaster, as the Muslim victory had occurred during a raid on a major Quraysh caravan, threatening the very economic foundation of Meccan power. Abu Sufyan ibn Harb, who had taken over leadership of the Quraysh after Abu Jahl's death, was determined to settle the score. He assembled a massive force by Arabian standards, 3,000 men, including 200 cavalry and 3,000 camels. Among the cavalry commanders, holding a position of crucial importance, was Khalid ibn al-Walid. At approximately 33 years of age, Khalid was in his prime, a warrior whose skills had been honed through years of training, and now, at last, would be tested in a major battle. The Quraysh army marched north toward Medina, the city that had become the refuge of Muhammad and his followers after they had fled Mecca 3 years earlier. With them came something unusual in Arabian warfare of that era: women from the noble families of Mecca, including Hind bint Utbah, the wife of Abu Sufyan. These women came to provide encouragement, to shame any warriors who might think of fleeing, to beat drums and chant verses that would steal the men's courage. Among them was Khalid's own sister. Their presence was a calculated psychological tactic, for no Arabian warrior wanted to be seen as a coward in the eyes of the women of his tribe. Muhammad, receiving word of the approaching army, faced a crucial decision. Should the Muslims wait within Medina, using the city's fortifications for defense, or should they march out to meet the enemy? After consultation with his companions, many of whom were eager to prove their courage in open battle, Muhammad decided to march out. The Muslim force that assembled numbered only around 700 men, less than a quarter of the Quraysh army. They had minimal cavalry, perhaps only 4 horses, and their equipment was sparse compared to the well-armed Quraysh. The two armies met near Mount Uhud, a rocky hill a few miles north of Medina. Muhammad positioned his forces with considerable tactical skill. He placed the mountain at the Muslims' back, using it to protect their rear and prevent the Quraysh from surrounding them. The right flank was naturally protected by the mountain itself. The critical vulnerability was the left flank, and to guard this, Muhammad positioned 50 archers on a small hill called Jabal al-Rumah. These archers were given explicit, unambiguous orders. They were to hold their position no matter what happened in the battle below. Whether the Muslims were winning or losing, whether the enemy advanced or retreated, the archers were to remain on their hill, preventing any flanking maneuver by the Quraysh cavalry. The commander of these archers was Abdullah ibn Jubayr, a capable warrior who understood the critical nature of his assignment. Muhammad's instructions to him were clear and emphatic. According to historical accounts, the Prophet told the archers, "Defend us from cavalry with your arrows. Keep them from getting at us from your side, whether the battle goes in our favor or against us. Keep your positions and do not leave them. If you see us being slain, do not come to help us, and if you see us victorious and treading the enemy underfoot, do not join us." The Meccan army arrayed itself facing the Muslims, with the bulk of the infantry in the center under Abu Sufyan's direct command. The left wing was commanded by Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl, son of the man who had been killed at Badr, and on the right wing, commanding the Quraysh cavalry, the most mobile and potentially most dangerous force on the battlefield, was Khalid ibn al-Walid. From his position on horseback, Khalid could survey the entire field. His experienced eye immediately identified the key features of the battle: the Muslim archers on the hill, the narrow frontage the Muslims occupied between the mountain and the open ground, the limitations imposed by terrain on both armies. The battle began with individual combats, a traditional feature of Arabian warfare where champions from each side would fight in single combat before the general engagement. The Muslims had some success in these preliminary encounters, raising their morale and unsettling some of the Meccan fighters. Then, the main forces clashed in the brutal, grinding combat of infantry battle. Sword met sword. Spear thrust was parried with shield. Men screamed and died in the dust and confusion. For a time, the battle seemed to be going the Muslims' way. The superior morale and fighting spirit of the Muslim warriors, who believed they were fighting for God's cause and that martyrdom in battle would lead directly to paradise, gave them an edge over the Quraysh, many of whom were fighting for honor and revenge, but lacked the same religious fervor. The Muslim center pushed forward, driving back the Meccan lines. On the Meccan side, panic began to set in among some of the fighters. The standard bearer of the Quraysh fell, and his replacement fell, and then another, until men began to hesitate to take up the banner. Seeing the Meccan infantry beginning to give way, many of the Muslim archers on the hill made a fateful decision. The battle appeared to be won. The enemy was in retreat, and down on the plain, the other Muslims were beginning to collect the spoils from the abandoned Meccan camp, gathering the valuable equipment and supplies that fleeing warriors had left behind. The archers, fearing they would miss their share of the plunder, began to descend from their position. Abdullah ibn Jubayr tried desperately to stop them, invoking the Prophet's explicit orders, but the majority ignored him. Only about 10 men remained at their posts with their commander. Khalid ibn al-Walid, observing the battle with a commander's eye, immediately grasped what had happened. The hill was now virtually undefended. The Muslim flank lay exposed. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the opening that could transform the course of the battle. Without hesitation, he acted. Wheeling his cavalry around the base of the mountain, moving at speed across terrain he had carefully scouted before the battle began, Khalid led his horsemen in a devastating flanking attack. The small group of archers who had remained faithful to their orders fought bravely, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. Khalid's cavalry swept over them, killing Abdullah ibn Jubayr and his companions, and then charged into the rear of the Muslim army. The effect was catastrophic. The Muslims, who moments before had believed they were winning, suddenly found themselves attacked from behind. Confusion reigned. In the dust and chaos, it became impossible to tell friend from enemy. The careful formation the Muslims had maintained dissolved into a confused melee. The Quraysh infantry, seeing what had happened, rallied and counterattacked. Now the Muslims were caught between the returning Meccan foot soldiers in front and Khalid's cavalry behind. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Warriors who had been advancing in triumph were now fighting desperately for survival. The casualties mounted quickly. Among the fallen were some of Muhammad's closest companions. Most notably, Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib, the Prophet's uncle and one of the greatest warriors among the Muslims, was killed by a javelin thrown by an Ethiopian slave named Washi. Hamza's death was a severe blow to Muslim morale. In the confusion, Muhammad himself was struck by stones thrown by Quraysh fighters. He fell, blood flowing from wounds to his forehead and lip. Rumors spread rapidly through the battlefield that the Prophet had been killed. This news sent many Muslims into flight, convinced that all was lost. But Muhammad had not been killed, only wounded. A small group of his most loyal companions formed a protective circle around him, fighting off wave after wave of attacks. Among those who distinguished themselves in defending the Prophet was Ali ibn Abi Talib, who, according to tradition, fought with such valor that even the enemies praised his courage. Khalid's cavalry continued to harry the Muslim forces, preventing them from reforming, exploiting every opening, turning what had been a Muslim victory into a potential rout. He demonstrated in this battle all the qualities that would later make him such a feared commander: the ability to read a battlefield and identify critical opportunities, the decisiveness to act without hesitation, the skill to coordinate mounted forces in complex maneuvers, and the aggressiveness to press advantages ruthlessly. Eventually, the Muslims managed to retreat to the higher slopes of Mount Uhud, where the terrain made it difficult for Khalid's cavalry to pursue effectively. The Quraysh, having inflicted severe casualties and believing they had achieved their objective of avenging the defeat at Badr, did not press the attack further. Abu Sufyan, surveying the battlefield strewn with Muslim dead, called out a challenge for the following year, suggesting they meet again at Badr. The Quraysh then withdrew, taking their wounded and leaving the Muslims to bury their dead. The Battle of Uhud was a significant defeat for the Muslims, and it was Khalid ibn al-Walid who had been primarily responsible for turning the tide. His tactical acumen, his ability to exploit an opportunity when it presented itself, and his skillful handling of cavalry had demonstrated that he was not merely a brave warrior, but a brilliant military commander. The Muslims would remember this lesson, particularly the disastrous consequences of disobeying orders and abandoning their positions prematurely. More importantly, Khalid himself would remember the tactics he had employed at Uhud, the devastating effectiveness of a well-timed flanking maneuver by mobile cavalry forces. These lessons would serve him well in years to come, though then he would be using them in service of the very people he had defeated at Uhud. For now, though, Khalid remained an enemy of Islam, and a victorious one. His reputation as a warrior and commander had been enhanced considerably. In the councils of the Quraysh, his voice carried new weight. He had proven himself in the ultimate test, had shown that he could handle responsibility in the confusion and pressure of battle, could make split-second decisions that would determine victory or defeat. The Quraysh had found in Khalid ibn al-Walid a champion who could match the Muslims in strategic thinking and exceed them in tactical execution. Yet even as his star rose among the Quraysh, forces were at work that would eventually bring about a transformation that few could have predicted. The conflict between Mecca and Medina would continue for 3 more years, but it would not always be a conflict of arms. Diplomacy, economic pressure, and the steady growth of Muslim power would all play their roles. And within Khalid himself, though he may not have fully recognized it yet, doubts were beginning to form, questions about the cause he served and the message he opposed. The long road to Medina. The years following the Battle of Uhud saw continued conflict between Mecca and Medina, but the nature of that conflict was changing. In 627 CE, the Quraysh made one final major military attempt to destroy the Muslim community, assembling a large coalition of forces that besieged Medina. This became known as the Battle of the Trench, named for the defensive trench the Muslims dug around the vulnerable approaches to the city. Khalid was present during this siege, again commanding cavalry, but the fortifications and the unexpected defensive strategy employed by the Muslims prevented the attackers from achieving their objective. After 2 weeks, with their supplies running low and their coalition fracturing, the besieging forces withdrew. This failure marked a turning point. The Quraysh could no longer hope to destroy the Muslims through military force. The following year brought another surprise. Muhammad and a large group of his followers set out from Medina with the announced intention of performing the Umrah, the lesser pilgrimage to Mecca. They came not with weapons of war, but as peaceful pilgrims, though their numbers, some 1,400 men, certainly represented a potential military force. The Quraysh, alarmed by this development, sent a cavalry force to intercept them. Khalid ibn al-Walid was at the head of this 200-man cavalry contingent, tasked with preventing the Muslims from reaching Mecca. Muhammad, receiving word of Khalid's blocking force, took an unexpected route, choosing a difficult path that bypassed the main road. By the time Khalid realized what had happened and reacted, the Muslims had positioned themselves at Hudaybiyah on the edge of Meccan territory. A tense standoff ensued. The Muslims had come for pilgrimage, not for battle, but they were prepared to defend themselves if attacked. The Quraysh did not want to be seen as preventing pilgrims from reaching the sacred sites, yet they were not ready to simply allow Muhammad and his large following into their city. What followed was one of the most significant diplomatic achievements of early Islamic history. Through negotiation, a treaty was reached that contemporary Muslims found frustrating and disadvantageous, yet Muhammad accepted its terms. The Treaty of Hudaybiyah stipulated that the Muslims would not enter Mecca that year, but could return the following year for pilgrimage. It established a 10-year truce between Mecca and Medina, opened up trade between the two cities, and included provisions about the return of individuals who joined either side. Many Muslims felt that they had given up too much and gained too little, but time would prove the treaty's wisdom. It provided a period of peace during which Islam could spread more freely. Merchants from Mecca and Medina could interact, and people who had been focused on warfare could turn their attention to other matters. During this period of relative peace, Khalid ibn al-Walid had time to reflect. He was now in his late 30s, a mature warrior who had seen much of life and death. The relentless military pressure that had characterized the first years of the Muslim community was easing, and in that breathing space, questions could be asked that had been pushed aside during the years of conflict. Khalid was an intelligent man, not merely a warrior. He could see that despite all the military efforts of the Quraysh, despite the resources they had expended, despite the battles they had won, Islam continued to grow. More than that, it was growing among the very kinds of people whose opinions mattered in Arabian society, not just among the poor and marginalized, but among warriors, merchants, and tribal leaders. The Treaty of Hudaybiyah itself must have given him pause. Muhammad had demonstrated sophisticated diplomatic skills, had accepted terms that appeared disadvantageous in order to achieve a larger strategic goal. This was not the behavior of a simple religious fanatic, but of a skilled leader who understood both immediate tactics and long-term strategy. The more Khalid observed, the more questions arose in his mind. The Muslims fought with a dedication and courage that exceeded normal military motivation. They endured hardships that would have broken other fighting forces. Their unity and discipline, despite coming from different tribes that had historically been rivals or even enemies, was remarkable. There were also personal connections that may have influenced Khalid's thinking. His brother, Khalid ibn al-Walid, had converted to Islam and fought at Badr on the Muslim side, though he had been captured by the Quraysh. Though al-Walid later died as a Muslim, his example would have shown Khalid that intelligent, capable men from their own family found truth in Muhammad's message. Other relatives and friends from the Quraysh were also converting, one by one, as they encountered Muslims, heard their message, and were impressed by their character and behavior. In the 8th year after the Hijrah, corresponding to 629 CE, Khalid made his decision. The traditional accounts preserve a beautiful detail about how this decision came about. Khalid is described as sitting one day, thinking deeply about the situation, perhaps pondering the trajectory of recent events. He said to himself, as the narrations record, "The message is spreading rapidly, and this man is certainly a prophet. What am I waiting for? How long shall I postpone my conversion to Islam?" Having made the decision, Khalid sought companions for the journey to Medina. He found 2 others who harbored the same intention: Amr ibn al-As, who would later become famous as the conqueror of Egypt, and Uthman ibn Talha, who held the keys to the Kaaba. These were not insignificant figures. They were prominent members of Meccan society, warriors and leaders whose conversion would be noted and discussed. The fact that 3 such men chose to make the journey together suggests that they had been discussing these matters among themselves, that the doubts and questions had been shared and debated. The journey from Mecca to Medina took several days, time for reflection, and perhaps for anxiety about the reception they would receive. After all, Khalid had been one of the most effective commanders fighting against the Muslims. He had been responsible for the death of many Muslims at Uhud. He had led forces that had opposed Muhammad at every turn. Would he be received with suspicion or hostility? Would the Muslims see his conversion as genuine or as some kind of trick? When the 3 men reached Medina and made their intentions known, they were granted an audience with the Prophet. The meeting must have been charged with emotion on all sides. Here was the man who had been one of Islam's fiercest opponents, coming now to submit to the very message he had fought against. Khalid's first words, as recorded in the traditions, showed his awareness of his past actions and his concern about them. He asked Muhammad to pray to Allah to forgive him for all his previous hostility toward Islam and the Muslims, for all the harm he had caused, for all the blood that had been shed in battles where he had led forces against the believers. Muhammad's response demonstrated the generous spirit and strategic wisdom that had made him such an effective leader. He reassured Khalid with words that would have lifted an enormous burden from the warrior's heart. The Prophet told him that converting to Islam erases all previous sins. It is a fresh start, a new beginning. Whatever Khalid had done before his conversion, whatever actions he had taken in opposition to Islam, all of that was forgiven by God. He was now a Muslim, a member of the community, with no black marks against him for his previous life. This doctrine of Islam, that sincere conversion wipes clean the slate of past sins, was one of its most appealing features. It offered hope and redemption to anyone, no matter what they had done before, as long as they sincerely embraced the faith. Nevertheless, despite these reassurances, Khalid insisted on the point. His conscience seemed to weigh heavily on him. He had fought against what he now recognized as the truth. He had been instrumental in Muslim deaths. He wanted to be absolutely certain that he was forgiven, that he could move forward without this burden of guilt. Seeing Khalid's sincerity and his evident distress about his past actions, Muhammad prayed for him. The Prophet asked Allah to forgive Khalid for whatever he had done before accepting Islam, to wipe away those actions and receive him fully into the community of believers. With his conversion accomplished, Khalid ibn al-Walid became a Muslim. But he did not become just another Muslim, another convert among the growing numbers who were accepting Islam in those days. Muhammad, with his keen eye for recognizing and utilizing talent, immediately saw in Khalid an asset of immense value. Here was a proven military commander, a man with tactical genius, someone who understood cavalry operations and desert warfare as well as anyone alive. The Muslim community had grown considerably, but it still had relatively few commanders with extensive experience in leading large forces. Most of the Muslims were brave individual warriors, but commanders who could coordinate complex operations were rare. Muhammad did something that showed both wisdom and grace. He not only accepted Khalid's conversion, he immediately gave him a position of honor and responsibility. The Prophet appointed Khalid as an official commander in the Muslim army, giving him authority and showing the community that this former enemy was now trusted with leadership. More than that, Muhammad gave Khalid a title that would follow him throughout history, a name that would become inseparable from his identity. He called him Saif Allah al-Maslul, the drawn sword of Allah. This was not merely a compliment or a nickname. It was a statement about Khalid's role in the future of Islam. He would be God's weapon, the sword that Allah had unsheathed against the enemies of the faith. Think about the significance of this title for a moment. A sword kept in its sheath is potential, waiting. A drawn sword is active, ready, dangerous. By calling Khalid the drawn sword of Allah, Muhammad was indicating that Khalid would be constantly active, constantly in use, an instrument of divine will in the expansion and defense of Islam. The title recognized Khalid's martial prowess while sanctifying it, transforming his military genius from a potential threat to Islam into a dedicated instrument for its advancement. The conversion of Khalid ibn al-Walid sent shockwaves through both Mecca and Medina. In Mecca, it was seen as a devastating blow to the morale of those who still opposed Islam. One of their best commanders, one of the heroes of Uhud, had not only abandoned the cause, but joined the enemy. If someone like Khalid, who had everything to lose and little to gain from conversion, had become a Muslim, what did that say about the truth of Muhammad's message? In Medina, particularly among those who had suffered at Khalid's hands during previous battles, the news must have been received with mixed feelings. Joy at gaining such a capable commander would have been tempered by memories of friends and family members who had died fighting against him. Khalid's conversion came at a crucial time. The following year, 630 CE, Muhammad would lead a massive force to conquer Mecca itself, finally bringing his home city under Muslim control, largely without bloodshed. The Treaty of Hudaybiyah, which had seemed so disadvantageous to many Muslims when it was signed, had done its work. It had allowed Islam to spread, had weakened Meccan resolve, had opened paths for people like Khalid to convert. When Mecca fell, when the conquest that had seemed impossible just a few years earlier was achieved, it marked the effective end of major Arabian opposition to Islam. But Khalid's story was just beginning. His conversion marked not the end of his military career, but rather the start of its most spectacular phase. Everything he had learned before, all the skills he had developed, all the tactical understanding he had gained, would now be employed in service of Islam. And the world was about to discover just how devastating the sword of Allah could be when fully unleashed. The Battle of Mu'tah, birth of the legend. The first major test of Khalid's loyalty and military skill in service of Islam came just months after his conversion. In the year 629 CE, Muhammad decided to send a military expedition to the northern borders of Arabia, into territory controlled by the Byzantine Empire. This was not a casual raid. The Prophet was sending a message to the great superpower of the region, demonstrating that the Muslims would not be confined to the Arabian Peninsula, that they were prepared to confront even the mightiest empires if necessary. The specific cause of the expedition was the murder of a Muslim emissary. Muhammad had sent al-Harith ibn Umayr al-Azdi to carry a letter to the ruler of Busra in Syria, but he had been intercepted and killed by Shurabil ibn Amr al-Ghassani, a client of the Byzantines. The murder of ambassadors was considered an outrageous violation of international custom even in those times, and Muhammad determined to respond with force. The Muslim army that assembled for this expedition was substantial by the standards of Arabian forces. 3,000 men, well equipped and prepared for a long march into hostile territory. Muhammad appointed 3 commanders in succession, a precautionary measure that showed he understood the dangerous nature of the mission. The first commander was Zayd ibn Haritha, the freed slave who had been adopted by Muhammad before the Prophet's marriage to Khadijah, one of the earliest converts to Islam and a man of proven loyalty and courage. If Zayd should fall, command would pass to Jafar ibn Abi Talib, cousin of the Prophet and brother of Ali, a warrior of exceptional bravery. If both should die, the third commander would be Abdullah ibn Rawaha, another of the close companions of the Prophet. The army marched north, traversing the harsh desert that separated Arabia from the settled lands of the Levant. When they reached the area near the village of Mu'tah in what is now Jordan, they received intelligence that made the scale of their challenge suddenly clear. The Byzantines had assembled a massive force to intercept them, an army that sources estimate at around 100,000 men, though modern historians consider this figure likely exaggerated. Even if we assume the actual numbers were considerably smaller, the Muslim force was still drastically outnumbered, possibly by 10 to 1 or more. Making matters worse, many of the Byzantine forces were not the provincial troops of Syria, but elite units that had been summoned to deal with this Arabian intrusion. The Muslim army halted at a place called Ma'an, just south of Mu'tah, to discuss their options. The situation was dire. They were far from home, deep in enemy territory, facing a force many times their size. Some argued they should send word back to Muhammad, requesting reinforcements or new orders. But Abdullah ibn Rawaha rallied the army with a powerful speech. He reminded them that they were Muslims, that they sought martyrdom as much as victory, that death in battle for Allah's cause was not defeat, but success. "O people," he said, according to the traditions, "what you dislike is the very thing for which you came out, seeking martyrdom. We are not fighting the enemy with numbers or strength or equipment. We fight them with this religion with which Allah has honored us. So come on, both outcomes will be good, either victory or martyrdom." His words struck home. The army decided to advance and meet the enemy, trusting in Allah and in their cause. As they moved toward Muta, they could see the dust cloud raised by the massive Byzantine army. The two forces met in battle, and from the first clash, the fighting was intense beyond anything most of the Muslims had experienced before. The Byzantines were professional soldiers, well-armored, well-armed, fighting in coordinated units. Against them, the Muslim force, though brave and motivated, was heavily outnumbered and outmatched in equipment. The battle quickly became a desperate struggle for survival. The three appointed commanders showed exceptional courage, fighting in the forefront of the battle, but the tide was against them. Zayd ibn Haritha, the first commander, fought fiercely until he was killed, his blood soaking into the foreign soil far from his home. Ja'far ibn Abi Talib took the standard and continued the fight. According to the traditions, Ja'far fought with extraordinary valor. When his right hand was cut off, he held the banner with his left. When his left hand was cut off, he held it with his arms. Finally, overwhelmed by enemy fighters, he was struck down, his body bearing dozens of wounds, all of them from the front, testimony that he had never turned his back to the enemy. Abdullah ibn Rawaha, seeing Ja'far fall, seized the banner and pressed forward, but he too was soon killed. The banner fell to the ground. The Muslim army, having lost all three appointed commanders, was in chaos. The Byzantines, sensing victory, pressed their attack. This was the moment of crisis, the point at which a leaderless army often disintegrates into panic and rout. But Thabit ibn al-Arqam, one of the Ansar who had been with Muhammad from the early days in Medina, snatched up the fallen standard. Rather than trying to rally the army himself, he looked for someone who could take command, someone with the skill and authority to organize a response to this disaster. His eye fell on Khalid ibn al-Walid. Though Khalid had been a Muslim for only a short time, his reputation as a commander was well known. Thabit pushed through the melee to reach Khalid and thrust the banner into his hands, calling out that he was giving him command because Khalid knew more about warfare than anyone else present. Khalid initially refused, showing appropriate humility and respect for those who had converted to Islam before him. He pointed out that Thabit was older, had been a Muslim longer, had more right to command. But Thabit and others around them insisted. They were in desperate straits, facing annihilation, and they needed the best commander available, regardless of seniority in Islam. Seeing their insistence and recognizing the critical nature of the situation, Khalid accepted command. What happened next would establish his legend and demonstrate why Muhammad had been right to give him the title Sword of Allah. Taking control of an army that was on the verge of disintegration, surrounded by a vastly superior force, Khalid began to work what seemed like a miracle. First, he assessed the situation with the cool rationality of a professional commander. The Muslims could not win this battle in a direct engagement. The numbers were too heavily against them. But neither could they simply flee. The Byzantine cavalry would run them down in the open desert. What Khalid needed was to break contact with the enemy, to disengage from the battle in a way that would preserve the Muslim army while preventing the Byzantines from pursuing them effectively. He reorganized the Muslim forces, a difficult task in the midst of battle, but his clear commands and evident confidence began to restore order. He personally rode through the ranks, speaking to the men, rallying their courage, organizing them into coherent units. Then, he implemented a tactical maneuver of brilliant simplicity and audacity. As night fell and the fighting paused, Khalid made his move. He quietly rotated his forces, shifting the right wing to the left and the left wing to the right. He moved the rear guard to the front and the front to the rear. He did this carefully and quietly, so the Byzantines would not realize what was happening. Then, he instructed a portion of the army to move behind the main camp and make noise, to kick up dust, to create the impression of reinforcements arriving. When morning came and the Byzantine commanders looked at the Muslim army, they saw what appeared to be a different force. The warriors they had been fighting the day before seemed to have been replaced. Fresh troops appeared to be in position. Dust clouds behind the Muslim lines suggested that reinforcements had arrived during the night. The Byzantine commanders, who likely knew that the Muslims had sent for additional forces, concluded that this was no longer the small, isolated army they had been fighting, but a much larger force that had been reinforced. Khalid then began a carefully controlled withdrawal, moving his forces back while maintaining formation and showing no signs of panic or disorder. He made periodic counterattacks to keep the Byzantines cautious, demonstrating that his army was still capable of fighting. The Byzantine commanders, uncertain about the true size of the force they now faced and mindful of the cost of their previous day's fighting, hesitated to commit to an all-out pursuit. According to Khalid's own later account, preserved in the historical traditions, the fighting was so intense during the battle that he broke 9 swords. This detail, whether literally true or somewhat exaggerated in the retelling, conveys the ferocity of the combat and Khalid's personal role in the thick of the fighting. He was not a commander who stayed in the rear, directing from safety. He fought in the front lines, where the combat was most dangerous, where his personal courage could inspire the men around him. Over several days, Khalid conducted a fighting retreat back toward Arabia, maintaining army cohesion, preventing the Byzantines from achieving the decisive cavalry pursuit that could have destroyed the Muslim force entirely. It was a masterpiece of military leadership under the most adverse circumstances imaginable. He had taken command of a defeated, demoralized army, surrounded by superior forces, and had extracted it largely intact. The casualties had been significant, particularly the loss of the 3 commanders who had been appointed by Muhammad, but the army itself had been saved. Back in Medina, Muhammad had been informed of what was happening through revelation. According to Islamic tradition, though the Prophet was far from the battlefield, he received divine knowledge of the events. He told his companions that Zayd had taken the banner and been killed, that Jafar had taken it and been killed, that Abdullah ibn Rawaha had taken it and been killed. Then he said that one of the swords of Allah had taken the banner, and Allah had given victory through him. This was when he gave Khalid the title by which he would be known for the rest of his life: Saif Allah, the sword of Allah. When Khalid returned with the army to Medina, the reception was initially hostile. Some of the Muslims, particularly those whose relatives had died in the battle, threw dust on the returning soldiers, calling them deserters, accusing them of fleeing from battle. This hurt Khalid, who knew that he had managed an almost impossible feat in preserving the army. But Muhammad came out to meet them and silenced the critics. The Prophet called them not deserters, but the tactical force, those who withdrew to return to fight another day. He praised Khalid specifically for his leadership and for saving the army from complete destruction. The Battle of Mu'tah was officially a defeat, in that the Muslims had not achieved their military objective of punishing the Ghassanids for killing the emissary. But strategically, it accomplished something important. It announced to the Byzantines that the Muslims were willing and able to project power far from their homeland, even against the armies of great empires. More importantly for our story, it established Khalid ibn al-Walid as a military commander of exceptional ability, someone who could be trusted with the most difficult assignments, someone who could snatch at least survival from the jaws of seemingly certain disaster. The Prophet's General. Following the Battle of Mu'tah, Khalid became one of Muhammad's most trusted commanders. When the Prophet marched on Mecca in 630 CE with a force of 10,000 men, Khalid commanded part of the army. The conquest of Mecca was achieved largely without bloodshed, a testament to Muhammad's strategic planning and the thoroughness of his preparations. When resistance did appear, Khalid was there to handle it. He led the attack against those who opposed the Muslim entry into the city, though Muhammad had given strict instructions to minimize casualties and avoid unnecessary fighting. Khalid also participated in the Battle of Hunain, which followed shortly after the conquest of Mecca. The Hawazin and Thaqif tribes, alarmed by the Muslim conquest of Mecca and fearing they would be next, assembled a large force and attacked. In the initial confusion, when some of the Muslims began to flee, Khalid was among those who stood firm around the Prophet and helped turn the tide of battle. His steadiness under pressure and his ability to rally troops in moments of crisis were becoming his trademark. But it was in smaller expeditions and raids that Khalid truly shone during this period. Muhammad sent him on various missions, and Khalid executed them with efficiency and usually with success. He was sent to destroy idols, to bring rebellious tribes into line, to extend Muslim authority into areas that had not yet accepted Islam. In each of these missions, Khalid demonstrated not only military skill, but also an ability to understand when to fight and when to negotiate, when to be harsh and when to be merciful. There was one incident, however, that showed the complex reality of early Islamic expansion and the sometimes harsh measures employed. Muhammad sent Khalid to the Banu Jadima tribe to call them to Islam, specifically instructing him not to fight unless they refused. When Khalid arrived, there was confusion about whether the tribe had actually accepted Islam or not. Their declaration of faith was unclear, and some of them took up weapons. Khalid ordered an attack, and some members of the tribe were killed. When Muhammad heard about this, he was deeply distressed. He raised his hands to heaven and declared his innocence of what Khalid had done, repeating 3 times, "O Allah, I am innocent before you of what Khalid has done." The Prophet then sent Ali ibn Abi Talib with money to compensate the families of those killed and to pay for the property damage. This incident showed that while Khalid was a brilliant military commander, he sometimes acted with excessive harshness, particularly in ambiguous situations. Muhammad's response, publicly dissociating himself from Khalid's action while also not removing him from command, showed the Prophet's wisdom in dealing with subordinates. He corrected the error without destroying the loyalty and effectiveness of a valuable commander. It was a lesson in leadership, showing that even trusted commanders could make mistakes and needed to be held accountable, but also that one error should not erase a lifetime of service. In 632 CE, during what would be the last year of Muhammad's life, Khalid participated in the farewell pilgrimage, the Prophet's final pilgrimage to Mecca. He was present during those momentous days when Muhammad delivered sermons that summarized his message, when the Prophet seemed to be preparing his community for his departure. None of them could know at the time, but this was indeed farewell. Muhammad would die a few months later, in the 11th year after the Hijrah, corresponding to June 632 CE. Crisis and chaos. The Ridda Wars begin. The death of Prophet Muhammad sent shockwaves through the Arabian Peninsula. The man who had united the tribes, who had given them a common cause and identity, who had been the direct recipient of divine revelation, was gone. The question that immediately arose was, What happens now? Who would lead the Muslim community? And perhaps more crucially, who among the Arabian tribes would remain loyal to the Islamic State now that the Prophet himself was no longer there to command their allegiance? The succession was resolved relatively quickly, though not without controversy that would have lasting consequences. Abu Bakr, one of the Prophet's oldest companions, his father-in-law and close friend, was chosen as the first caliph, the successor to Muhammad as leader of the Muslim community. Abu Bakr did not claim to be a prophet. That office had ended with Muhammad, who was declared to be the final prophet. But Abu Bakr would be the political and military leader of the Muslims, the one who would continue the work that Muhammad had begun. Almost immediately, Abu Bakr faced a crisis that threatened to tear apart everything that had been built over the previous 23 years. Across Arabia, tribes that had pledged allegiance to Muhammad during his lifetime now declared that those pledges had been personal to the Prophet. With his death, they argued, they were no longer bound to Medina. Some refused to pay the zakat, the obligatory charity that was one of the pillars of Islam. Others went further, declaring that they were no longer Muslims at all. Most dramatically, several individuals emerged claiming to be prophets themselves, gathering followers and establishing what amounted to rival political religious movements. The Ridda Wars, the wars of apostasy, had begun. The very survival of Islam as a political entity was at stake. If the tribes could simply opt out of their agreements with Medina now that Muhammad was dead, if the Arabian Peninsula reverted to the pre-Islamic pattern of fragmented tribes and constant warfare, then Islam would be reduced to a regional sect centered on Medina and Mecca, with no broader influence or power. Abu Bakr's response was decisive and uncompromising. He declared war on all those who had apostatized or rebelled. Some of Muhammad's companions questioned this decision, particularly regarding those who claimed they would still pray but would not pay zakat to Medina. Umar ibn al-Khattab, who would later become the second caliph, argued that perhaps they should be lenient with those who maintained the religious practices of Islam, even if they refused some political obligations. But Abu Bakr was adamant. Islam was not merely a set of spiritual beliefs, but a complete system, including political organization and economic obligations. To accept prayer but reject zakat was to tear apart what God had joined together. The campaigns that followed would test the mettle of the early Muslim community and would require all of the military expertise that commanders like Khalid ibn al-Walid could bring to bear. Abu Bakr organized his available forces into multiple army corps, each assigned a specific region or objective. The strongest and most important of these was commanded by Khalid. He was given the most dangerous assignments, sent against the most powerful rebel forces, trusted with the most critical objectives. Khalid's campaign during the Ridda Wars was a whirlwind of movement and battle. He marched first into the Najd, the central highlands of Arabia, where multiple rebel movements had emerged. His first target was Tulayha ibn Khuwaylid, a prominent figure from the Banu Asad tribe who had declared himself a prophet. Tulayha had gathered a significant following and posed a serious threat to Medina's authority. Khalid's approach to this campaign demonstrated his growing maturity as a commander. He used diplomacy as well as force, negotiating with tribes that seemed amenable to returning to the fold without fighting, using intimidation and displays of force to convince others to submit without battle. When fighting was necessary, he was ruthless and effective. He moved quickly, striking before his enemies could fully organize their defenses, using his intimate knowledge of Arabian terrain and tactics to maximum advantage. The Battle of Buzaka was the first major engagement. Tulayha had assembled a substantial force, drawing warriors from multiple tribes. The battle was fierce, with both sides fighting with the desperation of those who know there will be no second chance. Khalid's tactics were aggressive, pressing the attack relentlessly, not giving the enemy time to regroup or reorganize. When Tulayha's forces began to waver, Khalid exploited the opening, turning wavering into retreat and retreat into rout. Tulayha himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing into the desert and eventually finding refuge in Syria. Interestingly, Tulayha would later convert to Islam and become a Muslim warrior, fighting in subsequent Islamic conquests, a testament to the principle that conversion erases previous sins. With Tulayha defeated, Khalid moved on to other rebel strongholds. He subdued the Banu Fazara, the Banu Sulaim, the Banu Asad, and other tribes that had joined the rebellion or declared independence. Some of these campaigns were straightforward military operations. Others were more complex, involving negotiations, offers of amnesty, displays of strength meant to intimidate without fighting. Khalid proved adept at all of these approaches, knowing when each was appropriate. But it was during this campaign that Khalid committed an act that would remain controversial throughout Islamic history and would contribute to later tensions with Umar ibn al-Khattab. He encountered Malik ibn Nuwayra, a chief of the Banu Tamim tribe who had been a Muslim but whose status was now uncertain. There are conflicting accounts of what exactly happened. Some sources say Malik had completely apostatized. Others say he remained a Muslim but refused to pay zakat to Abu Bakr, arguing that he would keep the money to distribute among his own people. Still others suggest the situation was ambiguous, with Malik's intentions and actions open to interpretation. What is not in dispute is that Khalid ordered Malik's execution, and that shortly afterward, Khalid married Malik's widow, a woman noted for her exceptional beauty. This marriage particularly caused scandal, coming so quickly after the husband's death and raising questions about whether Khalid's judgment regarding Malik's apostasy had been influenced by his desire for the man's wife. When word reached Medina, Umar was furious. He demanded that Abu Bakr punish Khalid, even suggesting that Khalid should face qisas, the Islamic law of retaliation for killing a Muslim. Umar also accused Khalid of zina, unlawful sexual relations, arguing that the marriage was not valid because the waiting period after Malik's death had not been observed. Abu Bakr investigated the matter but ultimately declined to punish Khalid. His reasoning was pragmatic. He made a mistake in his judgment, so I will not sheathe a sword that God has unsheathed against the unbelievers. In other words, whatever the truth of the Malik ibn Nuwayra incident, Abu Bakr needed Khalid's military skills too badly to remove him from command over what might have been an honest error in judgment in an ambiguous situation. This decision, while pragmatic, left a lingering resentment in Umar that would have consequences years later when Umar himself became caliph. The most dangerous phase of the Ridda Wars was yet to come. In the region of Yamama, in what is now the eastern part of Saudi Arabia, a man named Musaylima had declared himself a prophet. Musaylima was no ordinary claimant. He was an intelligent man who had created what amounted to a rival religion, similar to Islam in many ways, but with enough differences to mark it as separate. He preached monotheism, but claimed to be co-prophet with Muhammad, dividing the world between them. He made his religious obligations somewhat less onerous than Islam, requiring only 3 daily prayers instead of 5, for instance, which made his teaching attractive to those who found Islamic requirements burdensome. Musaylima had built a strong base of support among the Banu Hanifa, one of the largest and most powerful tribes in Arabia. His following was not merely superficial or opportunistic. Many genuinely believed in his prophetic claims. He commanded an army that sources estimate at 40,000 men, far larger than any force the Muslims could field. This was not a mere tribal rebellion. It was an existential challenge to Islam itself. If Musaylima succeeded, if his movement survived and grew, Islam might be reduced to one sect among many Arabian religious movements. Abu Bakr initially sent other commanders against Musaylima, but they met with defeat. The false prophet's forces were too strong, too numerous, too well led. It became clear that only the best commander available could handle this challenge. Abu Bakr summoned Khalid from his campaigns in Najd and ordered him to Yamama. This was to be the supreme test of the sword of Allah. Battle of Yamama, the bloodiest day. The armies met in December 632 CE, near a place called Akraba in the region of Yamama. Khalid commanded a Muslim force that had been reinforced with some of the best warriors available, but even so, his army was vastly outnumbered. Musaylima's forces had the advantage of numbers, were fighting on familiar terrain, and were defending their homes and their prophet. The Battle of Yamama would become known as one of the bloodiest engagements in early Islamic history, a desperate struggle where neither side could afford to lose. The fighting began in the traditional Arabian style, with individual champions from each side engaging in single combat before the main forces clashed. But these preliminary duels, usually brief affairs, now took on a savage intensity that foreshadowed the main battle to come. When the armies finally engaged, the fighting was immediate chaos. Unlike some battles where one side gains an early advantage, Yamama was a grinding, brutal affair from the start. Musaylima's forces fought with the ferocity of true believers, defending their faith and their homes. They gave no ground easily, counterattacked when pushed back, and showed none of the hesitation that might have been expected from apostates fighting against Muslims. The Muslim army, for its part, understood that failure here could mean the end of Islam as a political force in Arabia. There would be no second chance, no opportunity to retreat and regroup. This battle had to be won at all costs. The initial phases of the battle went poorly for the Muslims. Despite Khalid's tactical skill and the motivation of his warriors, the sheer numbers arrayed against them began to tell. Musaylima's forces pushed the Muslims back, threatening to break their formation entirely. The Muslim center began to give way. Warriors who had fought bravely started to look for escape routes. The line between an organized retreat and a panicked rout is thin, and it appeared the Muslims were about to cross it. At this critical moment, several of the most prominent companions of the Prophet who were present in the battle made a dramatic decision. Realizing that ordinary measures would not suffice, that something extraordinary was needed to turn the tide. They made vows that they would not retreat, that they would fight where they stood until either victory was achieved or they were dead. They called on other Muslims to join them, to make the same commitment. It was a desperate gambit, but desperation was warranted. The Ansar, the Muslims of Medina who had given shelter to the Prophet and his companions when they fled Mecca, distinguished themselves particularly in this crisis. They formed a solid core that refused to break, that absorbed attack after attack without giving ground. Their steadfastness began to stabilize the entire Muslim line. Other warriors, inspired by their example, rallied and returned to the fight. The retreat stopped. The line held. Khalid, seeing this stabilization, understood that he now had an opportunity. He reorganized his forces in the midst of battle, a difficult and dangerous maneuver, but one he had practiced during his campaigns in Najd. He created a concentrated strike force, elite warriors who would punch through a specific point in Musaylima's line. Once a gap was created, Khalid would exploit it, pouring troops through the opening, attacking the enemy from multiple directions, creating the confusion and disorder that could turn a stalemate into victory. The plan worked, but not easily and not quickly. The fighting continued for hours, both sides suffering horrific casualties. The location would later be called Shuaib ud-Dam, the Gully of Blood, because of the rivers of blood that flowed there. Among the dead on the Muslim side were many of those who had memorized the entire Quran, Hufaz, whose loss would later prompt Abu Bakr to order the compilation of the Quran into written form, lest the text be lost with the death of those who had memorized it. Gradually, inexorably, the Muslim forces began to gain the upper hand. Khalid's tactical adjustments were working. The steady pressure of the Muslim advance, the repeated charges of his elite troops, the unshakable core of the Ansar who refused to break, all combined to wear down Musaylima's army. The false prophet's forces began to fall back, slowly at first, then more rapidly. The retreat became a rout. Warriors who had fought bravely for hours suddenly broke and ran, seeking safety in flight. Musaylima himself fell during the battle, killed by Muslim warriors. Some accounts credit Wahshi ibn Harb, the same man who had killed Hamza at Uhud and who had later converted to Islam, with striking the fatal blow. Others attribute the killing to different warriors. Regardless of who struck the actual blow, Musaylima's death broke the morale of his remaining followers. With their prophet dead, the religious basis for their resistance collapsed. The battle ended in a complete Muslim victory, though the cost had been staggering. The casualties on both sides were enormous. The Muslims lost perhaps 1,200 men, an enormous proportion of the army that had marched to Yamama. Among the dead were dozens of prominent companions of the Prophet and many of those who had memorized the Quran. Musaylima's forces suffered even more heavily, with estimates suggesting that 3/4 or more of his army was killed. The Banu Hanifa tribe, which had formed the core of his support, was devastated. The survivors surrendered, accepted Islam, and submitted to Medinan authority. The Battle of Yamama effectively ended the Ridda Wars. There were a few remaining pockets of resistance that took some months to fully subdue, but Musaylima had been the most dangerous of the rebel leaders, and his defeat broke the back of organized opposition to Abu Bakr's caliphate. By early 633 CE, less than a year after Muhammad's death, Arabia was united under Muslim rule once again. The crisis had been survived, though at tremendous cost in lives and blood. Khalid ibn al-Walid emerged from the Ridda Wars with his reputation as a military commander enormously enhanced. He had fought battle after battle, campaign after campaign, almost always successfully, often against superior forces, frequently in situations where defeat seemed likely. He had demonstrated not just tactical skill, but strategic understanding, not just personal courage, but the ability to inspire courage in others. He had shown himself willing to make hard decisions, to take calculated risks, to push forward when others would have counseled retreat. Abu Bakr's faith in him had been vindicated repeatedly. But the caliph was not finished with Khalid. Even as the last embers of rebellion in Arabia were being extinguished, Abu Bakr was planning something far more ambitious. The great empires that bordered Arabia, Persia, and Byzantium had long dominated the Middle East. These ancient powers had grown complacent, exhausted from decades of warfare against each other, troubled by internal dissent and economic problems. They were vulnerable, though they did not yet fully realize it. Abu Bakr intended to test that vulnerability, and for this task, for this audacious gamble of attacking the greatest empires of the age, he knew exactly whom to send. The sword of Allah was about to be drawn against enemies far more powerful than any Arabian tribe. The Persian Campaign, the Desert March. In early 633 CE, Khalid ibn al-Walid received new orders from Caliph Abu Bakr. He was to take his battle-hardened army from Arabia and strike into Iraq, the westernmost province of the Sassanid Persian Empire. This was an extraordinarily bold move. The Sassanid Empire was one of the two great powers of the age, a civilization with centuries of history, professional armies, sophisticated fortifications, and vast resources. For the Arabs to challenge such a power seemed like madness to outside observers. But Abu Bakr understood several factors that made this gamble more calculated than it might appear. The Sassanid Empire was in chaos following a catastrophic war with Byzantium that had ended only a few years earlier. The war had devastated both empires, draining their treasuries, exhausting their populations, leaving their frontiers weakly defended. Moreover, Iraq was not fully Persian. The population included many Arabs, members of tribes that had historic ties with the Arabs of the peninsula. There was a real possibility that some of these tribes would defect to the Muslim cause, or at least not strongly oppose it. Khalid marched north with an army of approximately 18,000 men, a force that had swelled with volunteers eager to join a commander with his reputation. The objective was Al-Hira, a city on the western edge of Mesopotamia that served as the capital of the Lakhmid Kingdom, an Arab kingdom that was a client state of Persia. Conquering Al-Hira would give the Muslims a major strategic base in Iraq and would demonstrate that even Persian client states were vulnerable to Muslim attack. The campaign in Iraq that followed demonstrated Khalid at the height of his powers as a military commander. He fought multiple battles, each a masterpiece of tactical excellence. At Walaja, he executed a double envelopment that would have been praised by Hannibal or Alexander. At Ulayis, faced with a numerically superior enemy that included Persian regular troops and Arab auxiliary forces, Khalid promised his men that he would personally kill as many enemies as they did, fighting alongside them rather than directing from the rear. The psychological effect of this promise, combined with brilliant tactical execution, led to a crushing victory. These battles revealed several characteristics of Khalid's command style. He favored aggressive tactics, seeking to bring the enemy to battle on terms favorable to the Muslims. He used mobility as a decisive weapon, constantly maneuvering his forces to attack enemy flanks or rear, refusing to be pinned down in static positions. He was a master of reconnaissance, always knowing where the enemy was and what they were doing, while keeping his own movements concealed until the moment of attack. He inspired tremendous loyalty in his troops, who knew that their commanders shared their dangers and would never order them into situations he was unwilling to face himself. Within months, Khalid had conquered a substantial portion of Iraq. Al-Hira fell to Muslim forces, and with it went Persian control over the western borderlands. Persian armies sent to stop him were defeated in battle after battle. The speed of the conquest was astounding, the more so because Khalid was fighting far from his base, in a foreign land, against an empire that should have been able to overwhelm him through sheer weight of numbers and resources. But even as Khalid was achieving these victories in Iraq, events were unfolding elsewhere that would lead to his greatest challenge and greatest triumph. In Syria, other Muslim forces had invaded Byzantine territory and had achieved some initial successes. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, the man who had defeated Persia and restored the true cross to Jerusalem just a few years earlier, was not willing to accept the loss of Syria without a fight. He began assembling a massive army to drive the Muslims out. Abu Bakr, recognizing that Syria was more strategically important than Iraq and that the threat from the Byzantines was more immediate than the threat from the crumbling Sassanid Empire, made a fateful decision. He ordered Khalid to march from Iraq to Syria, leaving his conquests under the control of other commanders to take charge of the campaign against Byzantium. What followed was one of the most remarkable marches in military history. Khalid would have to cross vast expanses of desert, much of it waterless, to reach Syria. The direct route was impossible for a large army. There was simply not enough water along the way to sustain thousands of men and horses. Khalid studied the problem, consulted with guides who knew the desert, and came up with a solution that was as ingenious as it was risky. He would take a small, elite force of around 500 to 800 cavalry, moving swiftly across the desert along a route that larger armies could not use. These men and their horses would carry as much water as possible, but it would not be enough. Khalid's solution to the water problem was brilliant and brutal. He would bring a herd of camels with them, but these camels would not carry supplies. Instead, they would serve as mobile water reservoirs. The camels would drink their fill before the march began, storing water in their bodies. As the march progressed and the army's water supplies ran low, camels would be killed one by one, and the water stored in their bodies would be extracted and used to keep the men and horses alive. It was a one-way trip. They would have just enough water to reach Syria if everything went according to plan, with no margin for error. The march began in April 634 CE. It would take Khalid's force through some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth, across vast stretches of sand and rock where temperatures soared during the day and plummeted at night, where a wrong turn could mean death by thirst for the entire force. They moved primarily at night, resting during the brutal heat of day, using the stars for navigation, following routes that only the most experienced desert guides knew. The journey took approximately 6 days, though some accounts suggest it might have been as long as 2 weeks, depending on the route taken. It was a trial by ordeal. Men and horses suffered terribly from thirst and heat. The landscape seemed endless, an ocean of sand broken only by occasional rocky outcrops. There were moments when it seemed the desert would claim them all, but Khalid drove them forward, his confidence and determination helping the men endure. The guides proved their worth, finding the scattered wells and oases that made survival possible. The camels, used as planned, provided emergency water when no other source was available. When they finally emerged from the desert near the Syrian frontier, they had accomplished something that military experts considered impossible. They had moved an effective fighting force across terrain that should have killed them all, maintaining secrecy and surprise. The Byzantine forces in Syria had no idea that Khalid was coming until he suddenly appeared with his cavalry, striking where he was least expected. The march across the desert would be celebrated in Arab military history as one of the great feats of endurance and leadership, comparable to Hannibal crossing the Alps or Napoleon crossing the St. Bernard Pass. The Syrian theater. Convergence of armies. Khalid's arrival in Syria in May 634 CE transformed the military situation there. The Muslim armies that had been operating in the region were several separate forces under different commanders. Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, Yazid ibn Abi Sufyan, Shurabil ibn Hassana, and Amr ibn al-As. Each had achieved some successes, capturing towns and defeating Byzantine garrisons, but they lacked overall coordination. The Byzantines were beginning to recover from their initial shock and were organizing a major counteroffensive. The Muslims needed unified command, and Khalid's reputation and ability made him the natural choice. The first major battle after Khalid's arrival was at Ajnadain, fought in July 634 CE. A substantial Byzantine force, including both regular imperial troops and local Syrian auxiliaries, marched to confront the Muslims. The battle that followed demonstrated Khalid's tactical brilliance. Rather than meeting the Byzantine advance head-on, he positioned his forces carefully, using terrain to channel the enemy attack, maintaining a strong reserve that he could commit at the decisive moment. When the Byzantines attacked, the Muslim forces absorbed the assault, then counterattacked with devastating effect. Khalid personally led cavalry charges that shattered Byzantine formations. The battle ended in complete Muslim victory, opening southern Syria to conquest. Following Ajnadain, the Muslim armies moved on Damascus, the great ancient city that was one of the jewels of Byzantine Syria. Damascus was strongly fortified, with high walls and a determined garrison. Taking it would require a siege, something at which the Arabs traditionally did not excel. But Khalid understood that sieges are as much about psychology as about walls and weapons. He surrounded the city, cut it off from reinforcement and resupply, and waited. Inside the walls, the defenders watched as their situation grew more desperate. Food supplies dwindled. Hope of relief faded. Morale cracked. After several weeks of siege, in September 634 CE, Damascus surrendered. The terms were relatively generous. The population was allowed to keep their property and practice their religion in exchange for paying the jizya, the tax that non-Muslims paid to the Islamic State. This pattern of conquest, followed by reasonably tolerant governance, helped explain why many Syrian Christians did not resist the Muslim conquest as fiercely as might have been expected. They had not been particularly well treated by the Byzantine Empire, which considered them heretics because they belonged to the Monophysite Church rather than the Orthodox Church of Constantinople. Muslim rule, with its promise of religious tolerance in exchange for a tax, seemed preferable to many. But even as Damascus was falling, events were unfolding that would profoundly affect Khalid's position. In Medina, Caliph Abu Bakr was dying. He had been ill for some time, and he knew his end was approaching. Before his death in August 634 CE, he designated Umar ibn al-Khattab as his successor. This was a momentous decision, ensuring a smooth transition of power and avoiding the kind of succession crisis that had threatened the Muslim community after Muhammad's death. But it was also momentous for Khalid ibn al-Walid because Umar had never fully trusted him, had never forgotten the incident with Malik ibn Nuwayra, and now would have the power to act on those reservations. One of Umar's first actions as caliph was to remove Khalid from supreme command of the Syrian armies. He replaced him with Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, a man of unquestioned piety and moral character, someone Umar could trust completely. The official explanation was that Umar feared people were beginning to rely too much on Khalid personally rather than on Allah. If Muslims started to believe that victories came from Khalid's genius rather than from divine support, their faith might be weakened. By removing even a successful commander, Umar was making a point that no man was indispensable, that success came from God. This explanation may have been sincere, or it may have been a politic way of expressing Umar's personal distrust of Khalid. Regardless, the decision was made. Khalid was informed that he was no longer the supreme commander. The news must have been crushing. He was at the peak of his abilities, had achieved victory after victory, had just captured one of the most important cities in the Byzantine Empire, and now he was being demoted. But Khalid's response demonstrated why, beyond his military genius, he was respected. He accepted the decision without protest or rebellion. He pledged his loyalty to Abu Ubaidah, who had been placed above him, and continued to serve as a subordinate commander. According to the historical accounts, Abu Ubaidah, who had been serving under Khalid and who was deeply aware of Khalid's superior military ability, tried to refuse the appointment. He argued that Khalid should remain in command, but Umar's orders were clear, and eventually Abu Ubaidah had to accept. The relationship between the two commanders became one of cooperation, with Abu Ubaidah officially in charge, but frequently deferring to Khalid's tactical judgment in military matters. This arrangement worked because both men were more concerned with the success of the Muslim cause than with their personal prestige. Abu Ubaidah recognized that he was not Khalid's equal as a military tactician, and he was wise enough to make use of Khalid's abilities, even though he formally outranked him. Khalid, for his part, could have made Abu Ubaidah's position impossible through sulking or non-cooperation, but he chose instead to support the new commander fully. It was a remarkable example of putting the collective good above personal interest. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, watching the Muslim conquest of Syria from his palace in Constantinople, understood that something had to be done. If Syria was lost, If the Muslims established permanent control over this wealthy and strategic province, the entire eastern frontier of the empire would be threatened. Egypt, the breadbasket that fed Constantinople, would be vulnerable. The holy city of Jerusalem would be at risk. The loss of Syria could be the beginning of the end for the empire. Heraclius began assembling the largest Byzantine army fielded in years, drawing troops from across the empire. Armenian contingents, Slavic auxiliaries, Byzantine regular troops, Arab Christian allies from the Ghassanid kingdom, all were gathered at Antioch and prepared for a massive counteroffensive. The sources disagree wildly on the numbers. Muslim historians often claim the Byzantine army numbered in the hundreds of thousands, while Western historians suggest a more modest but still substantial force of perhaps 40 to 50,000. Whatever the exact numbers, it was clearly the largest and best-equipped army the Muslims had yet faced, led by experienced commanders and backed by the full resources of an empire. Faced with this overwhelming force, the Muslim commanders made a difficult decision. They evacuated the cities they had conquered, including Damascus, and withdrew to a more defensible position where they could concentrate their forces. This strategic retreat made military sense, but it was psychologically difficult. They were giving up hard-won gains, abandoning cities that had submitted to them. But Khalid, whose voice carried great weight in the Council of War despite his demotion, argued that it was better to give up territory temporarily than to risk having their forces defeated in detail by a superior enemy. The armies met in August 636 CE near the Yarmouk River, a tributary of the Jordan River. The location would give its name to what would become one of the most decisive battles in world history. Everything that had come before, all of Khalid's victories in Arabia and Iraq and Syria, would culminate here. The Battle of Yarmouk would determine the fate of Byzantine Syria and, ultimately, would help shape the medieval world. The Battle of Yarmouk, 6 days that changed history. The battlefield that the two armies occupied near the Yarmouk River was a plateau of undulating terrain, cut by 3 deep ravines or wadis. These gorges, with their steep sides, created natural barriers that would play a crucial role in the coming battle. The Wadi al-Rukad lay to the west, the Wadi al-Yarmouk to the south, and the Wadi al-Alan to the east. In essence, the battlefield was a box bounded on 3 sides by these impassable ravines, with only the northern side open. This geography would prove decisive. The Byzantine army, under the overall command of an Armenian noble named Vahan, took up position to the west of the plateau, having crossed the Wadi al-Rukad by the Roman bridge on the road to Damascus. Their plan was straightforward: use their superior numbers to overwhelm the Muslim army through a series of massed attacks. They had professional soldiers, heavy cavalry, well-armed infantry, archers, and artillery. They outnumbered the Muslims significantly, perhaps by 2 to 1 or more. By any conventional military calculation, they should have won. The Muslim army, numbering perhaps 25 to 30,000 men, organized itself into a defensive formation. Abu Ubaidah was the nominal commander, but it was Khalid who organized the tactical dispositions and made the key decisions during the battle. Khalid divided the army into 4 main divisions: right wing, left wing, center right, and center left. Each division was assigned specific commanders who had proven their worth in previous battles. Behind these divisions, Khalid kept a mobile guard of elite cavalry under his personal command. This mobile guard would be the key to the entire battle, able to move rapidly to reinforce any threatened sector, to exploit any opportunity that arose, to serve as a fire brigade that could prevent disaster or create victory as circumstances required. For 5 days, the battle raged without a clear decision. Each day followed a similar pattern. The Byzantines would launch massive attacks against different sectors of the Muslim line, trying to find a weak point they could exploit, attempting to break through and then roll up the Muslim army from the flank or rear. Each day, the Muslim forces would resist with desperate courage, often being pushed back, sometimes in danger of breaking entirely. And each day, Khalid's mobile guard would gallop to the threatened sector, arriving at the critical moment to shore up the line, launch a counterattack, drive back the Byzantine assault. The fighting was brutal and exhausting. The August heat was oppressive, especially for the heavily armored Byzantine troops. The dust kicked up by thousands of fighting men and horses hung in the air, making it difficult to breathe and harder still to see. Men fought until they could barely lift their weapons, rested briefly, then returned to the fighting. The casualties mounted steadily on both sides. The Byzantines battered themselves against the Muslim lines day after day, suffering heavy losses, but always coming back for more, confident that eventually their numbers would tell. On the first day, the Byzantines focused their attack on the Muslim right wing, hoping to turn the flank and roll up the entire Muslim line. The fighting was intense, with the Muslim right being pushed steadily back, closer and closer to breaking. Khalid responded by leading his mobile guard in a savage counterattack against the Byzantine left center, striking at the flank of the Byzantine forces that were pushing against the Muslim right. The sudden appearance of fresh cavalry attacking from an unexpected direction disrupted the Byzantine assault and forced them to pull back to their starting positions. The second day saw similar patterns. The Byzantines again focused on the Muslim right, learning from the previous day's experience and adjusting their tactics. But again, Khalid's mobile guard intervened at the critical moment. The third day, the Byzantines shifted their focus to the Muslim left, hoping to surprise the Muslims with this change of target, but Khalid had anticipated the move and was ready. The fourth day was perhaps the most dangerous for the Muslims. The Byzantine attacks were so fierce, so sustained, that parts of the Muslim line actually broke. Some troops fled back toward the camps, pursued by Byzantine cavalry. But the Muslim women in the camps, rather than fleeing, armed themselves with tent poles and weapons and attacked the retreating soldiers, driving them back toward the battle and shaming them into returning to the fight. Meanwhile, Khalid once again led his mobile guard into the critical sector, stabilizing the line and organizing a counterattack that pushed the Byzantines back. By the end of the fifth day, both sides were exhausted. The Byzantines had failed to break the Muslim line despite repeated massive assaults. The Muslims had held their ground but had suffered terrible casualties. Both armies needed rest, needed time to reorganize and tend to their wounded. Vahan, the Byzantine commander, called for negotiations, hoping perhaps to arrange a truce or to buy time for reinforcements to arrive. But the negotiations went nowhere. The issues were too fundamental to be resolved by diplomacy. That night, as both armies rested uneasily, Khalid made his preparations for the final day. He had observed the battle carefully, had noted the geography of the battlefield, had identified the weaknesses in the Byzantine position. The Byzantines had their backs to the Wadi al-Rukad, the deep ravine crossed by a single bridge. If they needed to retreat, they would have to funnel across that narrow bridge, creating a potentially catastrophic bottleneck. Khalid intended to exploit this weakness. During the night, he sent a small cavalry force to circle around and cut off access to the bridge across the Wadi al-Rukad. This force, numbering perhaps 500 horsemen, took up a position where they could intercept any Byzantine troops trying to retreat across the bridge. Khalid also reorganized his main force, consolidating his cavalry into a single powerful striking force with the mobile guard at its core. He was preparing for an all-out offensive, a decisive attack that would either break the Byzantine army or break the Muslim forces in the attempt. Dawn of the sixth day brought the decisive battle. Rather than waiting for the Byzantines to attack, Khalid struck first. His plan was complex and daring, requiring careful coordination between multiple divisions. The Muslim center and left would attack the Byzantine right, drawing in the Byzantine reserves and fixing them in place. Meanwhile, Khalid would lead the main cavalry force in a massive charge against the Byzantine left center, seeking to punch through their lines, create chaos in the Byzantine rear, and cut off their line of retreat. The initial assaults went according to plan. The Byzantine right was engaged heavily, preventing Vahan from easily shifting forces to meet Khalid's main attack. Then Khalid launched his charge. The concentrated mass of Muslim cavalry, perhaps 8,000 horsemen, thundered across the battlefield toward the Byzantine left center. The shock of this charge was tremendous. The Byzantine left center, already weakened by days of continuous fighting, simply could not withstand the impact. The Muslim cavalry broke through their lines, trampling defenders, spreading confusion and panic. Once through the enemy lines, Khalid's cavalry did not stop. They wheeled and attacked the rear of other Byzantine units, creating chaos throughout the Byzantine army. Byzantine commanders, trying to respond to this crisis, found their communications disrupted, their formations broken, their carefully organized battle plan falling apart. What had been an organized army began to dissolve into separate groups of soldiers, each fighting for its own survival without coordination with the others. As the Byzantine formations broke down, panic began to spread. Soldiers started looking for escape routes, and many realized with horror that their retreat was blocked by the deep ravines. The narrow bridge across the Wadi al-Rukad, which should have been their escape route, was now controlled by Muslim cavalry. Those who tried to retreat in other directions found themselves trapped between Muslim forces and the steep walls of the ravines. What followed was not so much a battle as a massacre. Byzantine troops, trapped with nowhere to run, were cut down by Muslim warriors. Some tried to descend the steep sides of the ravines and fell to their deaths. Others attempted to cross the Yarmouk River and drowned in the attempt. The Byzantine army, which just days before had been the largest and most powerful force the Muslims had faced, disintegrated. The casualties were staggering. The commonly cited figure of 40,000 Byzantine dead is probably exaggerated, but even more conservative estimates suggest losses of at least 20,000, perhaps more, killed or captured. The Byzantine Empire had lost not just a battle, but an entire army. The Muslim casualties were also significant, perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 killed, but compared to the Byzantine losses, this was a sustainable cost. More importantly, the Muslim army remained intact as a fighting force, while the Byzantine army had been destroyed. Syria lay open to Muslim conquest. Jerusalem would surrender the following year. Within a few years, Egypt too would fall to Muslim forces. The Battle of Yarmouk had not just decided the fate of Syria, it had begun the process that would transform the entire Mediterranean world, shifting the balance of power from Christian Byzantine dominance to the emergence of a new Islamic civilization. For Khalid ibn al-Walid, Yarmouk was the crowning achievement of his military career. Everything he had learned, from his youth training with the Banu Makhzum, through the battles against Muhammad at Uhud, through his campaigns in the Ridda Wars and Iraq and Syria, all of it came together in those 6 days of battle. His use of mobile cavalry reserves to shore up threatened positions, his ability to identify and exploit the critical weakness in the enemy position, his tactical flexibility and willingness to take calculated risks, his personal leadership and ability to inspire men to superhuman efforts. All of these qualities were on full display at Yarmouk. Military historians studying the battle have marveled at Khalid's performance. He was outnumbered, but used terrain and tactics to neutralize that disadvantage. He maintained discipline and organization in his forces while inducing disorder in the enemy. He understood the psychological aspects of warfare, knowing when to defend and when to attack, how to preserve his soldiers' morale while destroying the enemies. The battle is studied in military academies to this day as an example of how superior generalship can overcome material disadvantages. After Yarmouk, the conquest of Syria proceeded rapidly. Cities that had hoped for Byzantine relief now recognized that no help was coming and surrendered on terms. The Muslim armies that had spent months besieging Damascus and other cities now found doors opening before them. Khalid continued to serve in these campaigns, though still technically subordinate to Abu Ubaidah. He led forces in northern Syria, capturing cities and fortresses, extending Muslim control ever further north toward Anatolia and Armenia. But the tensions between Khalid and Caliph Umar had not been resolved. Umar continued to receive reports about Khalid that troubled him. Some of these reports concerned Khalid's distribution of war spoils, which Umar considered too lavish to certain individuals, showing favoritism or poor judgment. Others revolved around more personal matters. Umar, who lived an austere lifestyle himself and believed in simple living, was disturbed by reports of Khalid's more comfortable lifestyle and his generosity with gifts. To Umar, this suggested that Khalid was becoming too focused on worldly matters, was perhaps losing the spiritual focus that should characterize a Muslim commander. In 638 CE, 2 years after the triumph at Yarmouk, Umar made his final decision regarding Khalid. He sent orders to Abu Ubaidah to publicly interrogate Khalid about his distribution of spoils and then, regardless of the outcome of this investigation, to remove him from military service entirely. This was not merely a demotion like the earlier removal from supreme command. This was complete dismissal from the army. When Abu Ubaidah received these orders, he was deeply troubled. He knew Khalid's value, knew his military genius, knew how much the Muslim armies depended on his leadership and expertise. But Umar's orders were clear, and Abu Ubaidah was not the type of man to disobey the caliph. He carried out the interrogation publicly in the city of Homs, questioning Khalid about gifts he had given to various individuals and the source of the funds used for these gifts. Khalid explained that the money had come from his own share of the spoils, not from funds that should have gone to the general Muslim treasury. The investigation found no wrongdoing in a legal sense. Khalid had not stolen or misappropriated funds. But Umar's order had specified that Khalid should be dismissed regardless of the investigation's outcome. So Abu Ubaidah had to inform Khalid that he was being relieved of all military duties and ordered to return to Medina. The scene must have been emotionally charged. Here was one of the greatest military commanders in history, a man who had never lost a battle, who had played a crucial role in securing the future of Islam, being publicly dismissed at the height of his capabilities. Khalid's response once again showed his character. He could have refused to comply, could have rallied the troops to his cause, could have created a civil war that would have torn apart the Muslim community. Many of his soldiers were personally loyal to him and would have followed him into rebellion. But Khalid did none of these things. Instead, he accepted the decision with grace. According to the historical accounts, he addressed the troops in various cities, bidding them farewell, thanking them for their service, and urging them to continue to serve faithfully under their new commanders. He then made his way to Medina to meet with Umar. The meeting between Khalid and Umar must have been tense and difficult. Khalid protested the decision, arguing that he had done nothing wrong, that his dismissal was unjust. But Umar stood firm. According to various accounts, Umar explained his reasoning. Some versions have him saying that he dismissed Khalid not because of dishonesty or incompetence, but because people were beginning to attribute Muslim victories to Khalid rather than to Allah, and this was a spiritual danger to the community. Other versions suggest that Umar simply did not trust Khalid, that he saw in him a man too focused on worldly glory, too much like the proud warriors of the pre-Islamic days. Modern historians have debated Umar's true motives. Some see sincere religious concern, a caliph trying to prevent a personality cult from developing around a military commander. Others see personal animosity, noting that Umar had never forgiven Khalid for the Malik ibn Nuwayra incident and was using his power as caliph to settle old scores. Still others suggest political calculation, noting that Khalid came from the Banu Makhzum clan that had been among the fiercest opponents of Islam in the early days, and that Umar, as part of his efforts to reduce the power of the old Meccan aristocracy, was cutting down this representative of that class. Regardless of Umar's motives, the result was clear. Khalid ibn al-Walid, the Sword of Allah, the undefeated commander who had conquered Arabia, defeated the Persians, humbled the Byzantines, was retired from military service. He was perhaps 46 years old, still in the prime of life, still in possession of all his mental and physical faculties, but his days of leading armies were over. The sword sheathed. Final years. After his dismissal, Khalid ibn al-Walid retired to the city of Homs in Syria, far from the political intrigues of Medina. He settled there with his family and, according to most accounts, lived quietly for the remaining years of his life. This was not the retirement of a man who continued to seek power or influence. By all accounts, Khalid accepted his fate and withdrew from public life, rarely leaving the city, no longer participating in the military campaigns that continued to expand the Islamic Empire. There is a poignancy to this end of a brilliant career. Here was a man who had shaped history, whose tactical decisions had determined the fates of nations, now living quietly in a provincial city. His brilliant mind, which had won battle after battle, was no longer employed in military planning. His organizational genius, which had coordinated armies across vast distances, was no longer utilized. The sword of Allah had been sheathed, not in glory on the battlefield, but in forced retirement. Yet there is no historical evidence that Khalid spent these years in bitterness or recrimination. He did not write memoirs criticizing Umar or attempting to rehabilitate his reputation. He did not scheme to return to power. By all accounts, he remained a faithful Muslim, performing his religious duties, supporting the Islamic State that he was no longer allowed to serve militarily. This suggests a man who had made peace with his fate, who understood that his life's purpose had been to serve Islam in whatever capacity he could, and if service now meant quiet retirement rather than battlefield glory, he would accept that. The years of retirement were not many. In 642 CE, approximately 4 years after his dismissal, Khalid fell ill. The nature of his illness is not specified in the historical sources. They simply record that he became sick and that it was clear he would not recover. As death approached, Khalid is reported to have reflected on his life and to have expressed a sentiment that has been preserved and repeated through the centuries. He said words to the effect, "I have fought in many battles and campaigns. There is no place on my body, from my head to my feet, that does not bear the mark of a saber strike, a spear thrust, or an arrow wound. Yet here I am, dying in my bed like a camel dies. May the eyes of cowards never sleep." These words express the warrior's ethos, the belief that a soldier should die in battle rather than in bed. For Khalid, who had built his entire identity around being a warrior and commander, who had faced death countless times and emerged victorious, to die of illness in bed must have seemed anticlimactic, even shameful. He had sought martyrdom, the death in battle that Islam honors, but it had been denied to him. This was God's will, not his own choice, but that made it no less difficult to accept. The location of Khalid's death is disputed in the sources. Some accounts, including those of prominent historians like al-Waqidi and Ibn Sa'd, place his death in Homs, where he had been living. Other accounts, including some preserved in the work of Ibn Asakir, suggest he died in Medina, having returned there before his death. Both versions exist in the historical record, and it is not possible to definitively establish which is correct. What is clear is that he died in 642 CE, during the Caliphate of Umar, approximately 10 years after the death of Prophet Muhammad. According to accounts that place his death in Medina, the news reached Umar while he was at the Quba Mosque on the outskirts of the city. When told that Khalid had died, Umar wept. He invoked the standard Islamic formula used when someone dies: "Indeed, to Allah we belong, and indeed, to Him we shall return." And he prayed extensively for Khalid, asking Allah to have mercy on him. Despite their differences, despite the tensions and the ultimate dismissal, Umar recognized Khalid's immense contributions to Islam. According to one report, Umar said, "By Allah, he was a shield against the enemy, blessed in his leadership." The accounts that place Khalid's death in Homs provide different details. They describe how Umar learned of the death from pilgrims who had passed through Homs on their way to Mecca. When he heard the news, Umar again wept and prayed for Khalid, showing that despite his decision to dismiss him, he had not been motivated by personal hatred, but by what he believed to be the best interests of the Muslim community. Khalid's funeral was attended by many people who had fought under his command and who remembered his leadership. The women of the Banu Makhzum, his clan, mourned him with particular intensity, observing a 7-day mourning period. According to some accounts, they tore their clothes and struck their faces in grief, traditional signs of mourning that Umar allowed despite his general disapproval of excessive displays of grief. He understood that Khalid's death was a significant loss and that people needed to express their sorrow. In the years following Khalid's death, his reputation only grew. As the Islamic conquests continued, as Muslim armies pushed further into Persia and North Africa and eventually to Spain, commanders studied Khalid's tactics and tried to emulate his success. Stories about his battles were told and retold, sometimes embellished, becoming part of Islamic military tradition. The title that Muhammad had given him, Saif Allah, the sword of Allah, became inseparable from his name. To Arab Muslims, Khalid ibn al-Walid became the ultimate exemplar of the Muslim warrior, combining faith with military genius, courage with tactical brilliance. Ironically, Umar himself would come to regret his decision to dismiss Khalid. According to several accounts, when Umar was on his own deathbed, mortally wounded by an assassin, he was asked whom he would choose as his successor. Umar replied that if certain men were still alive, including Abu Ubaidah, Mu'adh ibn Jabal, and Khalid ibn al-Walid, he would have chosen one of them as caliph. This statement, if accurately recorded, represents a remarkable vindication of Khalid by the very man who had ended his military career. It suggests that Umar, looking back from the perspective of his own impending death, recognized that his fears about Khalid developing a personality cult or becoming too powerful had been misplaced, that Khalid's loyalty to Islam had been genuine, and that his contributions had been invaluable. Khalid left behind a family, though his male line would not continue for long. According to the historian Ibn Hazm, writing in the 11th century, all 40 of Khalid's male descendants died in a plague in Syria around the year 750 CE during the fall of the Umayyad Caliphate. With their deaths, his direct male lineage ended. His properties, including his residence and other houses in Medina, passed to the descendants of his brother al-Walid. This fact adds another layer of poignancy to Khalid's story. The man whose name echoed through Islamic history left no direct descendants to carry on his bloodline. But in a larger sense, Khalid's legacy far transcended questions of bloodline or descendants. His real legacy was the Islamic empire he had been instrumental in creating. Every battle he won, every city he conquered, every enemy army he defeated, contributed to the rapid expansion of Islam from a small community in Arabia to a major world power. Without Khalid's victories in the Ridda Wars, Arabia might have fragmented back into pre-Islamic tribalism. Without his conquests in Iraq and Syria, the Islamic State might have remained confined to the Arabian Peninsula. Without his triumph at Yarmouk, the Byzantines might have pushed the Muslims back and prevented the conquest of Syria and Egypt. His grave, wherever it actually was, became a site of pilgrimage. In Homs, where tradition holds that he was buried, a mosque was built over his tomb, the Khalid ibn al-Walid Mosque. The current structure is not the original. It has been rebuilt and renovated multiple times through the centuries, but it stands as a physical memorial to a man who has never been forgotten in the Islamic world. Muslims visiting Homs would traditionally pay their respects at his tomb, praying there, asking Allah to grant them some measure of Khalid's courage and faith. Legacy: the undefeated sword. To understand Khalid ibn al-Walid's place in history, we must examine not just what he accomplished, but how he accomplished it. His military genius manifested in several distinct areas, each contributing to his extraordinary record of success. First, there was his mastery of cavalry tactics. Khalid understood mounted warfare as few commanders in history have. He knew how to use cavalry not just as a shock weapon, charging at enemy infantry, but as a mobile force that could respond rapidly to changing battlefield conditions. His mobile guard at Yarmouk, moving from crisis point to crisis point, serving as a reserve that could shore up the line or exploit an opportunity, demonstrated this understanding. He knew when to charge and when to hold back, when to seek a decisive engagement, and when to use harassment tactics, when to fight, and when to retreat. Second, there was his brilliant use of terrain and geography. Whether it was positioning the Muslim archers at Uhud when he fought against them, or using the ravines at Yarmouk to trap the Byzantine army, or choosing routes through the desert that his enemies considered impassable, Khalid always factored terrain into his planning. He understood that ground was not just a backdrop for battle, but an active element that could be used to advantage. Third, there was his psychological warfare. Khalid understood that battles are won as much in the minds of soldiers as through physical force. His march across the desert to Syria, his sudden appearances where the enemy did not expect him, his aggressive tactics that never gave the enemy time to rest or reorganize, all created psychological pressure that often caused enemy forces to crack before they were physically defeated. The reorganization of his forces at Mu'tah, creating the illusion of reinforcements, showed his understanding that perception could be as important as reality. Fourth, there was his strategic vision. Khalid was not merely a tactician who won battles, but a strategist who understood campaigns. His conquest of Iraq, moving from city to city, securing each gain before moving forward, showed strategic planning. His willingness to give up territory temporarily in Syria to concentrate forces for the decisive battle at Yarmouk showed strategic flexibility. He could think beyond the immediate battle to consider larger objectives and longer-term consequences. Fifth, there was his leadership and ability to inspire loyalty. Commanders can plan brilliant tactics, but if they cannot get soldiers to execute those plans, the brilliance is wasted. Khalid had the ability to make men willing to follow him into the most dangerous situations, to fight beyond their normal endurance, to maintain discipline and cohesion even in desperate circumstances. Part of this came from his personal courage. He fought in the front lines. shared the dangers of his soldiers, never asked them to do anything he would not do himself. Part came from his charisma and force of personality. Part came from his track record of success. Soldiers who had fought under Khalid and won came to believe they would always win, and that confidence became self-fulfilling. When military historians compile lists of history's greatest military commanders, Khalid ibn al-Walid usually appears among them, ranked alongside figures like Alexander the Great, Hannibal, Julius Caesar, Genghis Khan, and Napoleon. What sets Khalid apart from even these legendary figures is his undefeated record. Alexander never lost a major battle, but his career spanned only about 13 years of active campaigning. Napoleon won many brilliant victories, but also suffered several major defeats. Hannibal's brilliance at Cannae could not prevent his ultimate defeat at Zama. Khalid's career of major independent command spanned from about 632 CE to 638 CE, roughly 6 years, during which he fought dozens of battles and campaigns and never lost. The list of his victories is staggering. In the Ridda Wars, Buzaka, multiple engagements against various tribes, and most notably Yamama. In Iraq, Walaja, Ulais, Hira, and numerous smaller actions. In Syria, Ajnadain, Damascus, Fal, Marj al-Safar, and most significantly, Yarmouk. In each of these, he faced capable enemies, often in superior numbers, sometimes in unfavorable circumstances. Yet he won, often decisively, demonstrating tactical flexibility that allowed him to adjust to different enemies and different conditions. His tactical innovations influenced Islamic military practice for centuries. The use of mobile cavalry reserves, the emphasis on intelligence gathering and reconnaissance, the willingness to retreat strategically rather than fight to the death in unfavorable circumstances, the integration of different types of troops into coordinated plans, all became standard features of Islamic military doctrine. Subsequent Muslim commanders studied his campaigns and tried to apply his principles to their own situations. But perhaps Khalid's greatest legacy is more subtle and more profound than specific tactical innovations. He demonstrated that Islamic armies could defeat the greatest powers of the age. When the Ridda Wars ended and Abu Bakr launched the invasions of Iraq and Syria, there must have been many who doubted whether these Arabian warriors could stand against the professional armies of Persia and Byzantium. These were ancient empires with sophisticated military systems, fortifications, siege equipment, heavy cavalry, disciplined infantry. The Arabs had courage and faith, but would that be enough? Khalid showed that it was enough when combined with brilliant leadership and sound tactics. His victories against the Persians in Iraq and the Byzantines in Syria proved that Islamic armies could compete with and defeat any enemy. This confidence, this belief that Muslim forces could take on anyone and win, became a crucial psychological factor in the rapid expansion of Islam. When subsequent commanders led armies into Persia, Egypt, North Africa, and eventually Spain, they did so knowing that Khalid had already proven it could be done. The Islamic world has never forgotten Khalid ibn al-Walid. In the centuries since his death, countless books have been written about him, poems composed in his honor, stories told to children about his bravery and brilliance. Streets throughout the Arab world bear his name. Military units and academies honor his memory. When Arabs think of military excellence, when they contemplate what a Muslim warrior should be, Khalid ibn al-Walid provides the template. His story has also provided inspiration in troubled times. When Muslim armies faced overwhelming odds, when Islamic civilization seemed threatened, people remembered Khalid at Yamama, outnumbered and surrounded, yet refusing to accept defeat. When Muslims faced internal divisions and conflicts, they remembered how Khalid accepted demotion and dismissal without rebellion, putting the unity of the community above personal glory. When questions arose about how to integrate former enemies into the community, people pointed to Khalid, who went from being one of Islam's fiercest opponents to one of its greatest champions, showing that sincere conversion erases the past. In the West, Khalid is less well known than he deserves to be. Most Western military historians who study early Islamic expansion focus on the caliphs, on Abu Bakr and Umar, or on the broader strategic and social forces that enabled the conquests. Khalid, when mentioned at all, is often treated as merely a talented general carrying out the policies determined by others. But this underestimates his role. Without Khalid's victories, those policies would have failed. Without his genius, the early Islamic State might have collapsed during the Ridda Wars, or been pushed back by Persian or Byzantine counterattacks. In recent decades, as Islamic history has received more attention in Western academia and popular culture, Khalid's reputation has begun to spread beyond the Islamic world. Military historians studying the battles of Walaja and Yarmouk have recognized the sophistication of his tactics. Scholars studying the early Islamic conquests have acknowledged his central role in the success of those conquests. He is beginning to receive, in Western military historiography, something approaching the recognition he has always received in the Islamic world. Yet even now, his story remains imperfectly known outside Islamic civilization. Ask a Western audience to name great military commanders, and they will mention Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar, Napoleon. Few will mention Khalid ibn al-Walid, though his record of success equals or exceeds any of theirs. This is a loss, not just for Muslims who wish their heroes to be more widely recognized, but for anyone interested in military history, for Khalid's campaigns offer lessons that remain relevant. His use of mobility, his psychological warfare, his strategic patience, his tactical aggression, his ability to inspire troops, all provide examples that modern military professionals can study and learn from. Closing reflections. As we bring this journey through the life of Khalid ibn al-Walid to a close, we are left with a figure who embodies both the best qualities and the complexities of early Islamic history. He was a man of extraordinary talent and courage, a military genius who changed the course of history. Yet he was also a human being, capable of errors in judgment, operating in a world of ambiguous situations where right and wrong were not always clear, sometimes harsh in his actions, controversial in his decisions. His transformation from enemy to champion of Islam represents one of the great conversion stories in history. The man who nearly destroyed the Muslim community at Uhud became the sword that defended and expanded it. This transformation was complete and genuine. There is no historical evidence that Khalid ever wavered in his faith after his conversion, or that his service to Islam was motivated by anything other than sincere belief. Yet the story is also more nuanced than a simple tale of redemption. Khalid brought to Islam all the skills and fierce martial spirit that had made him such a formidable opponent. He did not become a different person. Rather, he redirected his existing qualities toward a new purpose. His dismissal by Umar represents a complex issue that Islamic scholars have debated for centuries. Was Umar right to remove such a successful commander from service? From a spiritual perspective, Umar's concern about personality cults had merit. Islam emphasizes that all power and success come from Allah, not from individual humans. To allow people to think that military victories came from Khalid's genius rather than from divine support could undermine this fundamental principle. From a political perspective, Umar's desire to demonstrate that no one was indispensable, that the Islamic State did not depend on any single individual, was sound. Leaders must sometimes make difficult decisions for the long-term good, even if those decisions seem harsh in the moment. Yet from a purely military standpoint, Umar's decision is harder to justify. Khalid was still in his prime, still capable of leading armies, still possessing the genius that had won battle after battle. To remove him from command deprived the Islamic State of its best military mind at a time when the conquests were still ongoing, when capable commanders were desperately needed. The Islamic armies continued to be successful after Khalid's dismissal, suggesting that perhaps Umar was right, that the victories came from Allah rather than from any individual commander. But one cannot help but wonder what Khalid might have achieved had he been allowed to continue in service. Khalid accepted his fate with a grace that speaks well of his character. He could have rebelled, could have used his popularity among the troops to resist Umar's authority, could have created a civil war that would have torn apart the Muslim community at a critical moment. That he chose not to do any of these things, that he accepted demotion and dismissal without complaint, suggests a man who truly had put the community's welfare above his personal interest. This aspect of his character, this willingness to submit to authority, even when he believed that authority was treating him unjustly, is as admirable as his military genius. In the end, Khalid ibn al-Walid's life offers multiple lessons. For military professionals, it offers examples of brilliant tactics and strategy that remain relevant today. For Muslims, it offers inspiration, showing how sincere faith combined with personal excellence can achieve great things. For anyone interested in leadership, it offers lessons in how to inspire and manage people, how to make difficult decisions under pressure, how to balance aggression with prudence, courage with wisdom. For anyone interested in character and ethics, it offers a complex portrait of a man of great talents, struggling to navigate the difficult waters of service, ambition, duty, and faith. The title given to him by Prophet Muhammad, Sayf Allah, the drawn sword of Allah, has proven to be remarkably enduring and apt. A sword is a weapon, an instrument, a tool used to achieve purposes. It has no will of its own, but must be wielded by someone else. Khalid understood this about himself. He was not the cause or the purpose. He was the instrument. The cause was Islam. The purpose was the expansion and defense of the Muslim community. He was the sword that served those ends. And because he understood this, because he never tried to become more than the instrument, he could accept when the sword was sheathed, when the wielder decided that the sword was no longer needed. As we conclude this story, as we reflect on the life of this extraordinary man, we are reminded that history is made by individuals, by human beings with talents and flaws, ambitions and doubts, courage and fears. Khalid ibn al-Walid was such a human being, a man who rose from the aristocracy of Mecca to become a champion of Islam, who transformed from enemy to defender, who fought in dozens of battles and never lost, who shaped the world through his military genius, and who accepted his eventual dismissal with grace and dignity. His story, 14 centuries later, still has the power to inspire, to instruct, and to fascinate. The sword of Allah has long since been sheathed, but the memory of what that sword achieved and the man who wielded it remains bright and sharp. In the streets and mosques and books of the Islamic world, the name of Khalid ibn al-Walid is still honored. In the study of military history, his campaigns are still analyzed for their tactical brilliance. In the story of Islam's early expansion, his role remains central and crucial. He was, quite simply, one of the most remarkable military commanders in human history. A man whose genius for war was matched by his dedication to faith, whose ambition was tempered by his willingness to serve, whose legendary victories were accompanied by legendary humility. May his story inspire us to excellence in whatever we do, to courage in the face of adversity, to faith in our purpose, and to grace in accepting both triumph and disappointment. The life of Khalid ibn al-Walid reminds us that individuals can change the course of history, that talent combined with dedication can achieve the seemingly impossible, and that true greatness lies not just in what we accomplish, but in how we conduct ourselves through the journey. And so we close this chapter of Moonlit Histories, this exploration of a life that burned bright and fierce, that carved out empires with sword and strategy, that transformed from opposition to championship, that ended quietly in retirement, but left behind a legacy that echoes through the centuries. The sword of Allah may have been drawn for only a few years, but in that time, it cut through the fabric of history and reshaped the world. Thank you for joining us on this journey through time, through the deserts of Arabia and the battles that changed civilizations. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the life of Khalid ibn al-Walid, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Moonlit Histories. There are many more stories waiting to be told, many more figures from Islamic history whose lives deserve to be explored, many more lessons from the past that can illuminate our present. Until next time, may you find peace in the stillness of the night, and may history continue to inspire and educate us all. Word count, approximately 25,000 words.